하는데 거기에서만 예외적으로 내가 화가로서의 역할도 조금은 노출했던 거라고 볼 수 있을 거예요. 비주얼 아트라고 이렇게 말하는 시각적인 표현 분야의 모든 표현 대상들, 뭐 예를 들면 사진을 찍어서 사실은 옛날식으로 암실에 들어가서 현상 인화를 한다든지 이런 기술에서부터 동영상 편집 기술에 이르기까지 이런 시각 문화 전반에 관한 기술을 가지고 있고, 글을 쓰니까는 글쓰기에 대한 관심도 늘 많고 또 책도 열심히 보고 하지만 무엇을 해야지, 새로운 걸 시도해 봐야지 하는 생각은 한 적은 없어요. 하지만 누군가가 저한테 와서 갑자기 무슨 동영상 편집을 해야 할 사람이 오늘 갑자기 아파서 안 나왔다. 그렇다면은 제가 옆에서 있다가 사실 내가 해줄 수 있으니까 해줄게 라고 말할 거예요. 그냥 그런 정도의 변화일 뿐이에요.
drawing more fans from all over the world. Local consumer prices continue to hover at the 2% success rate in April. Turning to robots to allow the visually impaired the chance to better indulge in cultural experiences. Like the number of hybrid cars are registered in South Korea has surpassed 2 million with this locally developed Yuri rocket. Arirang.
In our headlines on this Tuesday, April 14th, here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung calls on his administration to remain on high alert and to maintain the emergency economic posture as peace talks in Pakistan between the U.S. and Iran fail to bridge the gap over the differences. And tensions continue to mount in the Middle East as U.S. President Donald Trump confirms the start of a U.S. naval blockade of ships to and from Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz, as Tehran calls the U.S. action an act of piracy. Meanwhile, back here on the local front, South Korea's shipments of ICT products overseas for the month of March soared past $40 billion for the first time, bolstered by semiconductors. We start here in capital Seoul, where President Lee Jae-myung presided over yet another meeting of his cabinet and emergency economic authorities to call for continued attention on the events unfolding in the Middle East as tensions remain high. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yoo-jin reports.
Following the breakdown of peace talks between the United States and Iran over the weekend, President Lee Jae-myung has urged his cabinet to remain on high alert.
당분간은 글로벌 에너지 원자재 공급망의 어려움 그리고 고유가가 계속될 것입니다. 이를 상수로 두고 현재의 비상 대응 체제를 더욱 확고하게 다져나가야겠습니다.
Lee made the remarks while chairing a cabinet/emergency economic meeting at the Blue House on Tuesday, hours after the U.S. military began blockading traffic entering or exiting Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. The president first called for the swift implementation of the government's roughly $17 billion supplementary budget, which passed the National Assembly last week. A key part of the plan is the distribution of cash handouts to the bottom 70% of income earners, set to begin on April 27th.
지난해에 민생회복 소비 쿠폰 지급 당시에 일부 지자체에서 일부 지방정부에서 발생했던 비인권적인 행태가 혹여라도 반복되지 않게 각별하게 유념해 주면 좋겠습니다.
He was referring to some local governments using different colors for the voucher-style cash relief depending on income levels, which at the time raised concerns about stigmatization. Yi also called on the public to help reduce energy use, noting an increase in oil consumption following the government's price cap measures.
결국은 생산 원가와 실제 판매 가격의 차액 부분을 다 정부가 보전을 해줘야 되는데 그게 다 결국은 국민 세금 아니겠습니까?
South Korea froze the third round of fuel price caps for refiners at 1,934 won, or around $1.30 per liter for gasoline last week. Beyond managing domestic demand, efforts to diversify energy supply routes were also discussed. Having dispatched officials to Algeria and Libya, the foreign ministry shared plans to send a special envoy to the Republic of Congo. This comes after President Yi sent his chief of staff to Kazakhstan, Oman, and Saudi Arabia last week to secure additional supplies of crude oil and naphtha. With the conflict dragging on, South Korea is stepping up efforts to minimize disruptions as it relies heavily on energy imports from the Middle East. 송유진, Arirang News.
And U.S. President Donald Trump says a U.S. naval blockade of ships to and from Iranian ports is indeed in place in the Strait of Hormuz, while reaffirming his resolve to prevent Iran from possessing nuclear weapons. Our Kim Bo-kyung has the latest.
The U.S. officially said that it began blocking ships from entering or exiting Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz at 10 a.m. Monday U.S. Eastern Time. Speaking to reporters at the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed the blockade and claimed that Iran wants to make a peace deal very badly, adding that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon.
Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal.
According to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. military deployed more than 15 naval vessels to the region for the operation. Writing on Truth Social, Trump said the U.S. military had obliterated 158 Iranian ships and that any Iranian fast attack ships that go near a U.S. maritime blockade zone would be eliminated. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said that unreasonable demands from the U.S. blocked agreement during talks at the weekend. In a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday, he said Tehran had clearly outlined the conditions for the ceasefire and remained committed to them. He further claimed that Iran will continue negotiations only within the framework of international law. Regarding Washington's blockade of Iranian ports along the Strait of Hormuz, Pezeshkian warned that actions that threaten the strait will have widespread global repercussions. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Mr. Trump's allies in the UK and in France have spoken out against his blockade, proposing instead a summit this week to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Our Lee Sing-jae has more.
NATO allies are refusing to join U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, signaling they will only intervene after active fighting ends, a move that could deepen tensions within the alliance. The announcement comes after weekend talks failed to resolve the 6-week conflict with Iran. Trump said the U.S. military would work with partners to block all maritime traffic through the critical waterway, which handles roughly a fifth of global oil supplies. However, key NATO members, including Britain and France, pushed back, saying they would not participate in the blockade. Instead, they are preparing a separate initiative to reopen the strait and ensure safe navigation once hostilities subside. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK and France will co-host talks this week aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the strait.
And, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that together with President Macron, I will convene a summit of leaders this week to drive forward the international effort we have built in recent weeks, bringing together dozens of countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
He stressed that the talks will focus mainly on diplomatic efforts to bring pressure to bear for a negotiated end to the conflict and for the strait to be opened, and military planning to provide assurance to shipping as soon as a stable environment can be established. French President Emmanuel Macron also announced plans for a multinational mission to coordinate naval escorts and establish rules for safe passage through the waterway. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a continued dialogue between the United States and Iran following talks in Islamabad that ended without agreement. UN spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric said on Monday that the recent discussions were a positive step toward renewed diplomacy, despite ongoing differences.
Given the deeply rooted differences, an agreement cannot be reached overnight, and the Secretary General calls on the talks to continue constructively in order for an agreement to be reached.
He also urged all sides to respect ceasefire efforts and uphold international law, including the principle of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
South Korea, meanwhile, has started talks with Iran to secure the safe passage of 26 Korean flagged ships currently in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Seoul's foreign ministry has reportedly dispatched a special delegation to Tehran, and details about the vessels have been disclosed to senior Iranian officials there. The 26 vessels and their 173 crew members remain stranded in the strait amid the conflict between Iran and the U.S. These latest talks come in light of the two-week ceasefire that paved the path for peace talks in Pakistan this past weekend. Also on the negotiating table is humanitarian aid in response to international calls for assistance in the Middle East. In other news, former U.S. lawmaker Michelle Park Steele has been tapped by the Trump administration to head the U.S. Embassy here in Seoul. Our Ian Jin covers this nomination and the protocols ahead.
U.S. President Donald Trump has nominated Korean-American former Congresswoman Michelle Park Steele as the next U.S. ambassador to South Korea. This is according to a presidential nomination document released on Monday that included the former two-term Republican lawmaker from California. The ambassador post in Seoul has remained vacant since Philip Goldberg departed in January last year. The Blue House on Tuesday welcomed the nomination and expressed hope that her formal appointment would further strengthen Seoul-Washington relations and promote the friendship between the people of the two countries. The nomination comes at a time where Seoul and Washington face a range of joint tasks, including modernizing the bilateral alliance, addressing trade and investment issues, and cooperating on regional and global challenges such as the threats from North Korea and the ongoing Middle East conflict. Steele will be formally appointed upon the approval of the Senate, which could take up to several months. If confirmed, she would become the second Korean-American to serve as U.S. ambassador to South Korea after former Ambassador Sung Kim, who filled the post in Seoul from 2011 to 2014. Steele previously served on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during Trump's first term. She was first elected to the House in 2020, then re-elected in 2022, but lost her seat in last year's general election. In a social media post ahead of the 2024 election, Trump gave Steele his complete and total endorsement, casting her as one of the strongest congresswomen in the country and a, quote, America First patriot whose family bravely fled communism. Lee Jin, Arirang News.
South Korea's shipments of ICT products overseas for the month of March soared past $40 billion for the first time, bolstered by semiconductors. Our Kim Jun-hong reports.
Exports of South Korea's ICT products surged to a record in March, breaking above the $40 billion mark for the first time, driven by strong AI and chip demand. Data released on Tuesday by the Ministry of Science and ICT showed $43.51 billion of ICT exports in March, up 112% from a year earlier. The figure rose by about $10 billion from February, marking a 14th consecutive month of growth. In particular, ICT shipments accounted for more than 50% of the country's total exports. Semiconductor exports were the main driver, jumping 150% year-on-year to $32.84 billion. This marks the first time monthly shipments have topped the $30 billion level. The notable surge between February and March is largely due to increased exports of high-demand memory components.
HBM and conventional memory, including DRAM and NAND flash, appear to have played a key role in driving earnings. Samsung is increasing its HBM supplies to NVIDIA, while prices for standard DRAM have more than doubled, lifting margins. A similar trend is evident at SK hynix, and that is likely reflected in the overall results.
As production shifts toward next-generation HBM, the supply of general-purpose DRAMs has tightened, pushing up prices across the segment. These supply dynamics are expected to provide an additional boost to earnings in the near term. Mobile phones and computers saw double-digit growth, while displays and telecom equipment posted declines. Meanwhile, exports rose across all major markets, with shipments to the United States and China surging by triple digits. This helped push the ICT trade surplus to $27.36 billion, also setting a new record for a second consecutive month. With demand for AI chips expected to remain strong, earnings are likely to stay solid, with semiconductors taking on a larger share of the economy. Kim Junong, Arirang News.
We are counting down 50 days to South Korea's first local elections under the Lee Jae-myung administration. And while the ruling Democratic Party seeks to consolidate power, the main opposition People Power Party is striving to maintain its stronghold as it currently holds 12 out of the 17 local governments. Our political correspondent Moon Hae-ryun reports.
South Korea's June 3rd local elections are now exactly 50 days away, marking the first major nationwide vote since President Lee Jae-myung took office last year. The results will effectively serve as the first report card for the Lee government, and with the ruling Democrats already holding a majority in the National Assembly, it heads into the contest in a commanding position. President Lee's approval rating currently sits at over 60% for the fifth consecutive week, according to Realmeter, and polling shows Democratic candidates leading in key races across the country, including in traditionally conservative strongholds like Daegu. Party leader Chung Cheong-rae has made the party's ambitions clear.
We will sweep the country in a wave of blue and win the June 3rd local elections.
The Democrats have already confirmed candidates in 12 of the 16 regional races. The People Power Party, by contrast, is still mid-primary in several major districts. The situation is particularly turbulent in Daegu, where two prominent figures cut from the primary are signaling independent runs, a development that could split the conservative vote and potentially hand the Democrats a win in one of the country's most reliably conservative cities. People Power Party leader Chang Dong-hyuk, who grew criticism this week for departing on a 5-night trip to Washington 50 days before the election, has sought to project confidence.
We stand at the threshold of opening a greater future, built on 4 years of overwhelming achievement.
6 regions already have confirmed matchups, including Busan, Incheon, and Ulsan, where People Power Party incumbents will face senior Democratic challengers. Adding to the scale of the vote, up to 17 parliamentary by-elections could be held on the same day, promoting some to call it a mini general election. The most watched seat is in Busan, where the Democrats are courting the presidential AI advisor Ha Jong-woo to run, while former People Power Party leader Han Dong-won has effectively declared his own candidacy in the same district, raising the prospect of a high-profile 3-way race. With voting day still 50 days out, both parties are warning against complacency. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Also on the local front, regional tourism rose substantially in the first quarter of this year as more people chose to travel within national borders but beyond the Seoul metropolitan area. In fact, the regional visit rate rose to 34.5%, up 3.2 percentage points. According to the Culture Ministry, the number of foreign visitors entering through regional airports surged almost 50% on year.
The number of Koreans making regional trips to places such as Yeongwon, Gochang, Miryang, and Gangjin also jumped nearly 7% on year. These findings are being linked to government campaigns to spur regional tourism, like the half-cost travel program. Korea's southern port city of Busan is one of the most rapidly aging large cities with a high proportion of senior residents. That being said, city officials there have in place a number of employment programs aimed at making effective use of the experience and, in some cases, the empathy of the elderly in the workforce. Arirang's Park Junan files this report from the ground.
Hello, good morning.
A 75-year-old English-speaking tour guide is helping foreign tourists, directing them as they finish a cruise.
Being out here, meeting new people every day, guiding them and greeting them really adds energy to my daily life. Although I've gotten older, I feel appreciated as a member of society. I'm grateful for that.
And when moving to the village health center, it is common to see older adults taking care of other older adults. Programs such as health surveys and exercise sessions help people stay active and in shape. Some work involves classifying waste medication or disposing of it properly, crucial to environmental safety.
What you're seeing here is part of a citywide senior job program in Busan, with over 70,000 older people, about 10% of the elderly population, taking part.
And this is just a few examples out of numerous types of jobs that senior workers can take part in.
We want to show that we are not simply recipients of help, but are active contributors who add value to the community. We hope citizens will see us not as retired elderly, but as professionals with experience and wisdom.
For Busan, the number of older adults has already outpaced the city's young population of 19 to 34-year-olds. For the city, being able to bring older adults to the workplace is a must rather than a choice.
If we approach older adults as social resources who can play a role as members of the local community, I believe employment programs like this can function effectively in cities around the world.
For many cities and the global economy, as the city shifts into a super-aged society, the case of Busan serves as a real-world testbed. Park Junan, Arirang News, Busan.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. Hezbollah's leader on Monday publicly demanded that Lebanon cancel direct talks with Israel. The talks scheduled for Tuesday in Washington would be the first such face-to-face negotiations between the two countries in decades. Naim Qassem made the televised appeal, calling the meeting a free concession to Israel and the United States. Meanwhile, fierce fighting rages in the southern Lebanese town of Bint Jabal, where Israeli forces encircled the area and Hezbollah fighters launched rockets, artillery, and drones. Israel's military said its troops killed more than 100 Hezbollah fighters in the town and surrounding areas. President Donald Trump on Monday refused to apologize to Pope Leo XIV after launching a public attack on the Catholic Church's leader over his opposition to the U.S. war in Iran. Trump criticized the Pope on social media on Sunday, calling him weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy, then posted an AI-generated image depicting himself as a Jesus-like figure laying hands on a sick man. Following a backlash, the image was deleted on Monday, and Trump told reporters it was meant to show him as a doctor, not as Jesus. Pope Leo on Monday said we'll continue speaking out loudly against war. 2 days before tax day in the U.S., President Donald Trump on Monday had 2 bags of McDonald's food delivered to the Oval Office by a DoorDash driver, then handed her a $100 tip on camera to promote his administration's tax cut on tips. Driver Sharon Simmons from Arkansas told Trump the policy had put $11,000 back in her pocket as her husband battled cancer. When a reporter asked if the White House were good tippers, Trump reached into his pocket and handed her the $100 bill. Colombia on Monday ordered the killing of up to 80 hippos. The hippos are the wild descendants of animals drug lord Pablo Escobar illegally imported decades ago. They have spread across the country, threatening villagers and wiping out native species. Colombia's environment minister did not say when the culling would begin. Colombia is the only country outside Africa with a wild hippo population. Chu Ji-hyun, Arirang News.
Tomorrow, early summer heat will continue in the western regions. Temperatures will rise well above seasonal averages, reaching up to 27 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, along the east coast, where there are easterly winds, and along with some rain on the south coast, it'll feel relatively cooler. As for air quality, ultra-fine dust levels are expected to be good in most areas. And Jeju Island could see occasional rain through tomorrow morning. Tomorrow's Seoul will start the day at 12 degrees, Chuncheon at 9 degrees, Busan at 13 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 25 degrees, Gwangju at 27 degrees, Busan at 19 degrees. Looking ahead, warm conditions with daytime highs above 25 degrees will continue. More rain is expected across the southern regions and on Jeju Island this Friday. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. As always, thank you for watching.
여러분 안녕하십니까? 대한민국의 목소리를 세계에 전하는 아리랑 TV의 30주년을 축하드립니다. 2015년 7월 14일 UN 창설 70주년과 6.25 전쟁 UN군 참전 결정 65주년을 맞아 아리랑 TV와 UN 본부는 방송 송출 계약을 체결하고 본격적인 방송을 시작했습니다. 이리하여 아리랑 TV가 한국 방송 최초로 UN 본부 내에서 아리랑 코리아라는 이름으로 공식 방송을 개시한 순간이었습니다. 오늘도 아리랑 TV는 UN 본부 UN 채널을 통해서 24시간 시사 정보 채널로 방송되고 있으며 우리나라의 위상과 목소리를 국제사회에 전하는 중요한 역할을 해오고 있습니다. 아리랑 TV는 기후위기는 물론 역사, 국제 현안과 민감한 외교 문제에 이르기까지 대한민국의 입장을 전달하고 있습니다. 지금 국제사회는 그 어느 때보다 복합적인 도전에 직면해 있습니다. 이런 때일수록 정확하고 신뢰할 수 있는 정보와 소통이 더욱 중요합니다. 세계 각국 외교관들이 활동하는 UN 본부에서 아리랑 TV는 한국을 대표하는 공공 외교 미디어로서 의미 있는 역할을 수행한 길을 자랑스럽게 생각합니다. My warmest congratulations, Arirang TV. I look forward to seeing Arirang TV provide excellent content to global viewers for another 30 years and well beyond. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Latin America has been embracing Korean culture in recent years. And on Press Perspective today, we touch upon the factors fueling this phenomenon. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, April 14th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we delve into the popularity of K-culture in Latin America. For this, I have Rui Valdez with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Rui, welcome back.
Nice to be here, Sun-hee.
I also have freelance journalist John Bartlett joining our talk virtually from Chile. John, it's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Rui, we'll start here in the studio. Let's start then with your thoughts regarding the interest in K-culture in Latin America. How would you say does it compare to the past?
Well, it's quite a long story. I'll do my best to integrate it as brief as possible. But well, based also in John's article, which he integrated very well this history, we could talk about the presence of K-culture in different eras. First, the early roots, which was a migration that started from the beginning of the 1905, to be precise, when they arrived, a big group of immigrants from Korea to Mexico, to the Port of Mexico, which has a very dark history of abuse and forced labors that we're not going to get into today. And then there are then more like working class or people that emigrated to Latin America in search for better jobs and create some more, united communities. And What we could talk as a real presence of K-culture back in the day, we will have to add sports a little bit forcefully. Like Taekwondo was actually a kind of a big thing, especially in countries like Mexico. We have medalists of all kinds in the country because of the presence of that. So you ask somebody about Korea back in the day, probably they would say, well, Taekwondo, and that's it. But they will never talk to you about the music, let alone the cuisine. And then we jump into this little by little influence that starts early 2000s of Korean culture, very niche still, very small groups. Then to jump a little bit ahead on time, with consolidation on Psy, Gangnam Style, or, well, not that long ago when Parasite won the Oscar, and of course all the Korean dramas that expanded their influence not only in the entertainment, but also in other sectors like K-cuisine, like the food, because the audience saw these famous actors and actresses consuming certain types of products, using certain types of cosmetic, using certain type of fashion. So little by little, we have this whole expansion that to today, we can call it now a stage of deep integration and local adaptation. So right now, maybe before we could talk about it as a phenomenon, like a sporadic phenomenon, now we cannot talk about it in those terms. It is the pop culture of today. You cannot ignore Korean culture, especially in music and entertainment industry. And when I talk about deep integration and local adaptation, is that you now can see this merge of not only, of both cultures, of Latin America and Korean culture. One of the biggest examples now, Hive, the label of BTS, created this group called Santos Bravos, which is a K-pop Latin American group, which their songs are in Spanish. So that would be like a very big example of where all this is heading, right? It's like both cultures are, feedbacking, if I'm making up that word, but giving themselves feedback and evolving into something new. And yeah, well, not to take such a long time on this, I would say that lastly, just to see, for example, the intentions of labels like Hive, they just recently signed the latest album of Daddy Yankee. Maybe he by name doesn't sound as big in Korea, but I'm sure you have listened to his songs. He's like the father of this genre, reggaeton. So the fact that a South Korean label is making contracts with one of the biggest stars in music in Latin America tells you a lot about the future of this.
Right, indeed. Now, John, as Drew here in Seoul mentioned very briefly, you recently did an extensive piece, a team coverage, I believe, for The Guardian about the popularity of K-culture in Latin America. What's been your experience, that is, of covering K-culture there in Chile?
Yeah, so this is something I've been really interested in for a long time. In Chile, we have I wouldn't even call it a Koreatown. It's a tiny little sort of, it's basically 2 streets across the river, where a lot of the Korean community settled in Chile, mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's not something that comes from a big diaspora. That's often the case in Latin America, as Rui mentioned there. The Mexican diaspora was one of the, was the first, and then some of them obviously went on after these sort of quite dark episode of slavery and forced labor in the agave plantations on the peninsula there in Mexico. Some of them went on to Mexico, others went to Hawaii. I mean, the diaspora grew in the Americas around that time, around the turn of the century. But here in Chile, it's a tiny number of people that have actually come, and I've wanted to write something about it for a long time. And my original idea was to write something about Chile. I thought that the diaspora here was, kind of becoming overwhelmed by this interest in Korean culture. I mean, you see, now I think I reference this in my story. We went from, 5 or 6 Korean restaurants, even when I got to Chile 8 years ago, and now there are nearly 50, I think, in that one tiny neighborhood where a lot of the owners are Chileans who are kind of profiting from the boom. People really interested in K-dramas and K-pop, obviously. I mean, that's the kind of driving force, I think, here in Chile, where we already have quite a lot of influence of other Asian cultures, but Korean culture has just become this this phenomenon. It's absolutely amazing how it's happened here. So I started with that, really. I looked at kind of how people were, how people were taking Korean culture, taking it on. They were starting to listen to music that I hadn't heard much of before, but obviously I think now we've all heard, some kind of, BTS or Blackpink or one of the big K-pop bands, whether we know it or not. And then I saw these kids dancing in the reflections. I mean, that's, I think that's a kind of a thing that's happening all over the world at the moment. Sort of young people taking these dances and really getting involved with these the kind of the K-pop culture. So yeah, I got into that, and then I started to mention it to friends and talk to different people here, and people mentioned other factors that I'd never thought about before. One of the big things at the moment, and I'm not sure how this is kind of translating in Korea as well, but here in Latin America is skincare. I mean, a lot of people talk about kind of Korean skincare here in Chile, in different countries as well. One of the influencers I talked to as well, a Korean influencer, she told me that most of her endorsements now come from skincare companies rather than these K-dramas or K-pop or any of these other elements of the culture. So yeah, that's how I started. And my editor said to me, why don't we make this a regional story? And my colleagues in Mexico and Brazil got involved as well and sent in some great sort of feeds and interviews from these different countries.
Right, it was a great report, if I may say so myself. Rui, with regard to K-pop, I remember Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, she kindly invited BTS to hold more concerts in Mexico. How significant would you say is cultural diplomacy between South Korea and its counterpart in Latin America?
Well, I would say now is more important than ever. And I will make maybe a little bit of a stretch connecting to the current state of affairs in the world. But well, let's start explaining. Yes, indeed, the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum invited President Lee Jae-myung. Oh, well, first of all, she asked President Lee Jae-myung if he could help her to open more dates for concerts of BTS, considering that the demand in Mexico was so high that prices were skyrocketing in reselling, or also there was basically no tickets. They all sold out very fast, so it was very hard to get. Of course, Mexican president is also using it as a political strategy to attract young voters. But putting those things aside, what is interesting is how come a president at that level can publicly send or inform that he's sending this type of letter for this kind of matters of a group that is owned by a private company or whatever, but now as a tool, as you mentioned, for cultural diplomacy. Later on, she expanded that she invited President Jae-myung in September. This has not been confirmed by the Blue House, but yeah, well, at least maybe it's a sign that there's a strong interest to meet. The other thing that is worth to note is that when she mentioned this invitation, again, she's putting it in the context of BTS. She's not saying, okay, we're gonna talk about Korean investments or companies that are there. She's saying, oh, okay, we will discuss about opening more dates or maybe organizing a live concerts or mentions of that sort. Why I think now is more important than ever, this cultural diplomacy? Well, right now, South Korea especially is in a moment where they have explicitly said that they are reaching to other countries, other regions, to sign trade agreements or things related to energy amid all the war in the Middle East, which of course Korea imports most of its oil from there. I am not saying that it's going to be a fact or it's going to be hard to know if actually it's going to be like a bargain coin precisely. But of course, I do think it's important to first establish a connection between two countries that are making some kind of deal. So it's very different now to approach Mexico as, let's say, 10, 15 years ago when K-culture was not as big as today. And to now that's saying, okay, the president of Korea is coming to Mexico, or is coming to Chile, or is coming to Latin American countries where K-culture has a very high presence. And I think that will get the attention not only in the political sphere, but also just in the general public, no? So yeah, I do think it has become this. It has acquired a relevance that it's very hard. It was very hard to predict in the past.
Right, indeed it was. John, what do you believe are the factors that appear to be fueling the popularity of K-culture in Latin America?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that the most sort of visible face of all of this, I think, was K-pop to start with. Like I say, that's how I kind of, became more aware of what was happening. But nowadays it seems to be, these dramas as well. Squid Game was a huge, huge success here, as it was all over the world, of course, but particularly here in Chile, I remember there was a sort of time where people were, as soon as the second series of that came out, there were the masks were being sold on the street in Chile, which I think is interesting sort of ironies there as well, given what it's largely a sort of capitalist satire. But it was a very interesting sort of moment where all of these kind of sort of memorabilia and masks and things were being sold. Obviously, K-pop is still absolutely huge here. A lot of the restaurants that you can Korean restaurants that you can go to kind of have these videos on loop and are constantly playing these sort of K-pop hits and things. I think one interesting thing here, particularly in Chile, actually, is that, as I mentioned before, we've had these, Asian cultures have always had quite a lot of prevalence here in Chilean culture. I mean, Japanese kind of manga and cartoons and animation has been, huge here in the country for a really long time. And that goes back kind of, even before the sort of the Korean diaspora, arrived here in any meaningful numbers. So yeah, I think, there was already sort of fertile ground here, particularly in Chile. And I think a lot of other countries as well in the region. I mean, I know that in Peru, I think in Argentina, slightly less. They have a slightly more kind of pride, I guess, or not pride in their own culture, but they have more of a sort of, insular kind of culture, I guess, in Argentina than in certain other countries in the region. But I think that the fact that these sort of, Japanese culture arrived here first, people were already used to seeing these cartoons. They were already used to often watching kind of, subtitled sort of Japanese shows, for example. When Korean shows came along, they seemed to, perhaps not replaced it so far, but they seem to have, sort of taken precedence, I think. So yeah, it's really interesting. But I'd say that the growth at the moment is in series, in K-dramas, in these sort of, sort of telenovelas, basically, that you get in Latin America. And people are watching Korean shows now, which, certainly when I first arrived here, I wasn't aware of. Maybe it was already happening, but I think it's really grown in the last few years.
Right, K-Screen Productions and of course K-Beauty, as you mentioned earlier. Rui, the Culture Ministry here, it recently unveiled its latest Overseas Hallyu survey. If I were to ask you to highlight 2 key findings in this latest survey, what would you choose to highlight?
Well, the main highlight here is that almost 70% of respondents who have experienced Korean cultural content of any sort, they have a positive perception on it. The second highlight, I will skip music because we already discussed about music, but one thing that really caught my attention was that food ranks higher in this survey, and this survey was made from people of 30 different countries. And in this survey, 78% of the people say they have tried Korean cuisine. I'm making an emphasis on this because I don't think that's something, let's say, why do I think that is relevant? Is because if you go, even I'm from provincial city in Mexico. If I would think about my childhood or my younger years, I would never imagine going to a Korean restaurant. Probably there was just one restaurant, just few people would go, probably the same Korean community will go to a restaurant. And yes, if you go right now back to that city, it's massive, the explosion. Like you have dozens at least of Korean restaurants, and you talk to people, and what did you do on the weekend? Well, I went to a Korean barbecue, and like, really? In León, in my city? Well, yeah, so I think these numbers really reflect everything that we have discussed of the impact that it has right now in the region.
Right. I mean, as John was saying, there were 5 restaurants in Chile when he arrived there first 8 years ago, and now there are more than 50 or so. John, your article, right, it quotes the Brazilian health minister to explain Latin America's interest in Asian culture. I wonder, would you like to take this opportunity to perhaps elaborate on his thoughts and your takeaways?
Yeah, so that interview actually my colleague in Brazil did, but I think it was a really important sort of, a really important element to this whole story. And it's something that I emphasized when I kind of, pitched this idea at the beginning. I thought he basically what Alexandre Padilla is called. He said that he, his daughter basically kind of, looks to Korea now, looks across the Pacific rather than to North America for her sort of, cultural influences and things. So I think that it's a really important thing. I mean, you know, we're all following kind of world events at the moment, and I think that as the US continues on the path it's on at the moment, I mean, there's this sort of obviously this sort of introspection and sort of inward looking that they're doing in terms of foreign policy and even culture to an extent as well. I think that people here in Latin America are looking less towards the north. Obviously, there's always going to be a relationship between the US and Latin America, and this sort of famous idea that it's the US's backyard that they talk about a lot. But I think that, I mean, Rui maybe can talk about this as well, that Mexico obviously is much closer to the US, sharing a long border. But, you know, down here in Chile, I think that people are looking far less towards North America nowadays. And I don't know if that has anything to do necessarily with, the direction that the US has taken. But I do think it's certainly a phenomenon that's worth studying. And I think there's an opportunity for Korea there as well, if we talk about the Hallyu and sort of this soft power approach that South Korea has. There's an opportunity in Latin America, and I think that, you know, in a lot of countries around the world, as they start to perhaps not turn their backs on the US, but as people start to look elsewhere, and maybe North American culture doesn't hold quite the appeal that it used to. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think on the food as well, which is something that Rui was discussing there before. I think that's something that's arrived in Chile relatively recently, and I think that it's interesting looking at kind of how those two kind of culinary sort of like cultures, how they interact, because in Latin America, parts of Latin America, people really like spicy food. Here in Chile, people do not like spicy food at all. Like, Chilean food is incredibly I won't say bland, but it's not spicy. Let's put it that way. So I mean, it's, you know, kind of introducing these kind of fermented foods like kimchi, getting spicy foods, people here to try them, and I think it's really starting to take off here. Like, tastes are changing, and I think Korean cuisine actually is playing quite a large part in that. People are starting to try things that just weren't available here before, or, you know, kind of the ingredients have been replaced, and as often happens in diasporas, you know, people end up kind of trying to make the dishes they used to back home with the ingredients available to them in the country they settle in. So things have changed quite quickly here, and I think that, you know, Korean culture is having a really outsized influence in a lot of aspects of Chilean society.
Right, indeed. So the Korean wave, it started off, like we mentioned earlier, with K-pop, moving on to K-dramas, and then including K-beauty, K-skincare, as John mentioned. In recent times, though, there have also been greater interest in Korean history. This being said, how far does this overall interest in the Korean wave look to go, and what do you hope it will include in the future?
Well, I think it's as related to everything we have been discussing. Like, many of these dramas that we were mentioning, some are even set in historical periods, and similarly we see now with K-pop Demon Hunters, this big hit in Netflix, that they also include traditional elements of Korean culture, and they go too far on the past, and they show you different aesthetics or elements that are more connected not to pop culture but to history, to ancient history of Korea. So yes, in a way, it's a consequence of what we have been discussing. So the next step, or what we're seeing right now, is, yeah, there's not only interest in pop culture, but also in history, in language, culture, identity, all these elements. And for example, you could see this happening a lot in the students level, university students level. Like, before, when I arrived to Korea 2017, I think there was maybe more than 100 Mexicans in Korea. Now it's on the thousands. And it's because they're counting the students that are here in long-term periods. You walk around during the BTS concert, and you see these, many of them are people that are studying here, and it's now not limited only to this cultural part. This student could be a student of Korean studies. It could be a student of mechanical engineering. It can be a student of all these different, or history, to put it in that sense. But it's inevitable that they will end up absorbing these other elements if they are constantly consuming Korean content or different aspects of Korean culture. So yeah, basically what we're seeing is a growing trend of people getting more interested, like the users in Duolingo, or like people that come here just to experience that part of the culture. If you walk these days, just as a personal experience also, is if you walk these days through downtown Seoul, And I'm talking about the last 6 months, not the last year, the last 6 months. It's really impressive how many people you see speaking Spanish or Portuguese. I've never seen anything like that in all my years here. And they are not only visiting, of course, Hive headquarters. They are going to the main palace. They are going to see King Sejong's statue, etc., etc. So yeah, I think it's inevitable consequences of all this.
Right, indeed. And speaking as a South Korean, I believe it's a very flattering and humbling experience to see so many foreign visitors choosing to visit South Korea. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. As always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sonia.
John, all the way in Chile, thank you so much for joining us at this very early hour at your end. Right, I'm afraid, John, we can't hear you, but I'm assuming you're saying thank you for having you on, right?
Having me.
All right. Right. Well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you again same time tomorrow. That is Wednesday.
The snow is accumulating rapidly.
Temperatures are dropping fast, so stay safe out there. Look behind